Hello everyone, my name is Yara and today we are going to be recommending books by Arab authors. I had the idea to make this video because April was Arab American Heritage Month in the US. Obviously it is not April anymore, but I still wanted to use this as an opportunity to highlight Arab authors. All of these are books that I've read and recommend, but there's a lot of books by Arab authors that are on my TBR, so hopefully by next year I'll have more to even recommend. Before I get into the list, I do want to make some clarifications because in doing research for this video, I came across a lot of lists of books seemingly by Arab authors that were not actually Arab authors. A lot of them were either other ethnic identities or the authors were just Muslim, so they were put into the Arab category. So just to clarify things, Arab is both an ethnic identity as well as referring to countries that primarily speak Arabic, the language. It is different from Middle Eastern, which includes a bit more countries. And it's also different from Muslims. Even though most Arabs are Muslim, most Muslims are not Arab, which is a fact that a lot of people are not aware of. So this is just a PSA to anyone making these kinds of recommendations lists to just double check and do a little bit more research into the identities of the authors that you're recommending and making sure that they align. And that goes for me too. I did a lot of research and really tried to make sure that all of the authors identify themselves as Arab. But I also know that there is a lot of different perspectives, especially regarding ethnic minorities in Arab countries who may not identify themselves as Arab. So if that's the case for any of these authors, please let me know and I will correct that moving forward. So I'm going to be splitting up this video by age demographic of the books, beginning with YA, then going to adult, and then going to middle grade. And also one more thing to mention is that not all of these books feature Arab characters or Arab settings. This list is simply just about the authors. The first book I have is As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Kato, who is Syrian-Canadian. This book takes place in Homs, Syria in 2011 and follows a character named Salama, who is a first-year pharmacy student. She is a student during the onset of the Syrian Revolution and has to put her education on halt as she volunteers in the hospital during the war. Her brother had been recently arrested for protesting, and her sister-in-law is pregnant, and so as this violence is increasing, Salama is growing unsure of whether she can stay in Syria or not. She ends up meeting a boy named Kinan, who is a photographer trying to capture all that is going on in Syria and trying to show the world. And they begin to form a friendship and deeper bond as they both try to help their families in any way that they can. I forgot to mention in the beginning of the video, but I am Syrian, and that's why it's so important for me to try to read from Arab authors. But it is also why this book hit really close to home and why I loved it so much. It can be tragic and heartbreaking in a really visceral way, but also has these moments that are really sweet and hopeful. It explores the conflict of staying where you are and trying to help out as much as you can with the desire to find safety in a really honest way. And I think it was just fantastic. So if there's any book you read off of this list, then I definitely recommend this one. The next book I have is The Lines We Cross, or alternatively titled When Michael Met Mina by Randa Abdel Fattah, who is Palestinian-Australian. This is a YA contemporary romance about Mina, who was a refugee from Afghanistan who has now moved to Australia, and Michael, who is the son of a very anti-immigrant, xenophobic group in Australia. When Michael meets Mina in school, he is instantly infatuated and really wants to get to know her, but in getting to know her, really has to confront the ideologies that he's grown up with from his parents. And that's one of the things that I really liked about this book, was that it had the cute elements of a YA romance, but it also had this very direct and blatant confrontation of Islamophobia, of xenophobia. Mina was a really compelling character who... not the sirens. Mina was a really strong and compelling character who did not accept just being the exception in Michael's eyes. She really wanted and needed him to grow from his ignorance. And I thought it was a really good portrayal of that. I think this book is really underrated and isn't really talked about that much. So if you're into YA contemporary, I would definitely check this out. Also, I've talked about a lot of these books in my wrap-ups in the past. So if I have, I will link it so you can get a little bit more in-depth of my thoughts. Next we have All-American Muslim Girl by Nadine Joel Courtney, who is of Circassian descent via Jordan and Syria. This is one of those cases where I was not sure whether to include her because she does mainly identify as Circassian, which is an ethnic minority in a lot of Arab countries. But she herself has also promoted her books during Arab American Heritage Month, so I wanted to make sure that it was included. This is also a YA contemporary, and it follows our main character, Ali Abraham, who is your typical all-American girl. She's a straight-A student, she's popular, she's dating the most popular boy in school, Wells Henderson. The only problem is that Wells's father is a very conservative and Islamophobic news anchor, and Ali's family is Muslim, even though no one really knows about it. Ali didn't really grow up Muslim, so it wasn't really something that she connected to or identified with a lot. But as more Islamophobic acts happen in her community, as well as to her own father, who was racially profiled on a plane, she becomes more curious about the faith and connecting to it again. And this is probably the book's greatest strength, is this portrayal of her personal journey as she starts connecting back to her culture. I think it's something that a lot of people who grow up in the diaspora go through in terms of reconnecting with either their heritage or their faith on their own terms a little bit later in life. And it was really good at exploring the implications of her all-American identity and specifically how that affected her social circles once she started to more openly identify as Muslim and as Circassian. So yeah, a really nice coming-of-age story to check out. The last YA book I have to recommend is The Forbidden Wish by Jessica Corey, who is of Syrian descent. This is a standalone fantasy novel that is a retelling of the story of Aladdin, except 1 is from the genie's perspective and 2, the genie is a girl. You slowly see the development of a relationship between Zara, the genie, and Aladdin, but Zara's feelings and relationship to Aladdin are tested when she is given an offer of freedom by the king of the jinn, only at the cost of betraying Aladdin. This book was honestly delightful. I loved the romance. It had all the banter that you'd expect out of a retelling of Aladdin, but it also did take the time to expand upon this world of the jinn as well as the real-life world and the political machinations going on in the kingdom, where the Jasmine character is queen, I think, or princess. Again, not a book that a lot of people talk about. Granted, it was published a couple years ago, but it's definitely worth reading if you tend to like YA fantasy, if you like fairy tale retellings, and if you're looking for a standalone fantasy novel. So now we're moving on to the adult category, and the first book I have is The Map of Salt and Stars by Zain Jokhadar, who is Syrian American. So this book is part contemporary, part historical fantasy, but we mainly follow a 12-year-old girl named Noor who recently moved back to Syria with her family after her father passes away. But unfortunately, the time they move back coincides with the start of the Syrian Revolution in 2011. After her family's neighborhood and home is destroyed by bombings, her and her family find themselves traveling as refugees across the Middle East and North Africa. Throughout the journey, Noor tells herself a story that her dad used to tell her to help bring her comfort in that time, and this story is the second timeline that we have. It takes place 800 years earlier and follows Rabia, who is the daughter of a widow who disguises herself as a boy in order to apprentice under the world's most famous map maker, El-Idrisi. El-Idrisi is commissioned by the king of Sicily to make a map of the world, and so Rabia comes along with his band of map makers. As well as exploring new parts of the world, they encounter different mysteries and creatures that they have to solve. What interweaves these stories together is the fact that Rabia and Noor are following the same journey and going along the same path. They are both confronted by their worst fears and challenges, and also driven by a sense of longing for a home and for stability. This book is also written really beautifully and really adds to the level of fantasy and fable that the historical part has, and the tragedy and heartbreak that the current timeline has. Obviously, if you're a fan of literary fiction, I think you should check this out, but I think also if you tend to read more YA contemporary, then this book is a good stepping stone if you are looking to read more literary fiction. I think it's pretty accessible, though a little bit slow because of that writing style. The next book I have is one that I actually recently reviewed, and that is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Emil Al-Muhtar and Max Gladstone. Emil Al-Muhtar being the Arab author in that duo, who is of Lebanese descent. This is a very popular book. You probably don't even need me to recommend it to you, but you probably didn't know that it was at least partially written by an Arab author. This is a futuristic sci-fi novella about two competing time travel special agents, Red and Blue, who begin to write letters to each other, and the entire book is written through these letters. They are each fighting for a different timeline, one that is gearing towards a more technology-focused future and one that is gearing towards a more biofuturistic setting. Despite the sci-fi premise, the book is really rooted in the human connection between these two special agents, Red and Blue, and the eventual romantic connection that they develop. This book is insanely lyrical and poetic. Not a lot of plot, mostly vibes, which is good or bad depending on your preference. but overall a lot of character introspection and yearning. A lot of yearning. The next set of books that I'm going to recommend are actually translated works from Arabic, and they are all actually books that I read for classes in college, so shout out to my professors for picking these books. But I definitely wanted to make sure that I included books by Arab authors not only in the diaspora, which are important, but especially in America, those diaspora narratives tend to be the ones that are centered, and not of the narratives of people who have lived in the Middle East. The first book is Dreams of Trespass, Tales of a Harem Girlhood by Fatma Mernissi, who is Moroccan and specifically Amazighi, which is an indigenous group in North Africa. So just a little background, Fatma Mernissi is a sociologist, and she's actually considered one of the key voices in Islamic feminism and the Islamic feminism movement in Morocco. And this story is what I would consider autofiction, where it is fictionalized, but it is heavily inspired by her own childhood living in a domestic harem in Fez, Morocco in the 1940s. A lot of the story focuses on Fatma's observations of the women in her household, her mother, her grandmother, her aunts, and the other women as well, who form this community and who talk about their frustrations with the patriarchal structure that they live in that they don't believe is supported by the beliefs of Islam. They tell her stories of both real and fictional women, as well as show her the ways that they secretly rebel and assert their autonomy, and a lot of this is through their encouragement of Fatma's education. I really enjoyed reading this book. It very much felt like a slice of life novel as you just kind of follow Fatma as she lives through her daily life. There are a lot of historical and cultural references to things like World War II or the French occupation of Morocco. I think this would be a great book to start out with if you are trying to get into translated works from the Arab world. It's really accessible, and I think also has a lot of comedic moments and cute moments regarding the family that I think are fun to read. Okay, sorry for the angle change, but I had to go replace my camera battery. But the next book that I have to recommend is Absent by Batul Khaderi, who is an Iraqi writer. This takes place in Baghdad in the early 90s during the international sanctions against Iraq, and explores the devastating effects that it had on the economy and the infrastructure through the lens of this small community. The story mainly follows a girl named Dalal, who is an orphan but is living with her aunt and uncle. But through her you also get to meet a lot of other members of the community, a local fortune teller, a hairdresser, her friend who is a nurse volunteering in the hospital. I was looking at the reader's guide for this novel, and there was a quote in it that I think really accurately described what this book is doing and what it's talking about. It says, "This novel portrays the less privileged people struggling in the back lines, suffering the toll of the political decisions made in the front lines, yet they are absent. This is a story that talks about an old Iraq, known to Iraqis but unknown to the West, and it ends with a new Iraq, known to the West but unknown to Iraqis." I feel like I learned a lot reading this book about a time in history that I personally didn't really learn a lot in school. Like, I was kind of young during the American invasion of Iraq, but it's at least still mentioned, but I really had no idea that this history went even earlier. Even the 90s is not that much earlier, but there was a lot of history that I just hadn't known about. And this book doesn't directly comment on a lot of the political things happening. It was more so a jumping off point for me to look into that history. This book is similar to Dreams of Trespass in the way that it is kind of slice of life, but this book is definitely darker, and it also takes a turn. Things just kind of like gradually happen that slowly introduce cracks into the foundation of this community until everything just crumbles beyond what they were already going through. Kind of in that vein is the next book that I have to recommend, which is The Story of Zahra by Hanan al-Sheikh, who's a Lebanese writer. It's also about the everyday consequences of war, but this time it's taking place during the Lebanese Civil War in 1986, or at least I think it begins on that time. It's kind of hard to explain the plot of a lot of these stories because there isn't like necessarily something that is driving them, but is more so characters reacting to the horrible situations that they are put in. Like, Zahra's life begins already pretty tragically. Her father treats her very horribly, and her mother during her childhood used her as a cover for her affair against her father. She decides to move away to another country after a man offered to marry her, and when she comes back to Beirut, she finds that there's even more trouble with more military presence in her town. It's definitely a very tragic book. Out of the last three I just talked about, this one is definitely the hardest one to read. I also do want to mention a heavy trigger warning for sexual assault in this book. It is one of those stories that is very difficult to read, but it also was a really fascinating look into Zahra's life, her psyche, just what drives the decisions that she makes and how she reacts to all these situations. So if this is a book that you think you'd be interested in, I do think there's a lot to gain from it. The last book that I have to recommend out of these translated books is actually not a book, it is a short story, and that is Returning to Haifa by Ghassan Kanafani, who was a Palestinian author. This is actually a part of a larger short story collection that he wrote, but I only read Returning to Haifa, which I think is the most famous one, or the title of the collection. I definitely wanted to include it just to highlight the fact that Ghassan Kanafani is a very significant Palestinian author. Returning to Haifa is about a Palestinian couple who were forced out of their homes, as well as forced to leave their young son behind after their town was besieged during the Nakba in 1948. And this story goes back and forth between flashbacks to that time when they were forced out to currently when they are returning to Haifa in 1967 to find their house now occupied by an Israeli couple and that their son has been raised all this time as an Israeli. It's a short story, but it is one that is extremely powerful and one that I think really highlights the idea of homeland and what it means to lose access to your homeland. What does it mean to return to a home that you know is yours but has been so fundamentally altered? And how it feels both literally and figuratively to see your family history be erased. Obviously, now more than ever, it is important to actually engage and learn about Palestinian narratives and these narratives that have existed for so long and continue to happen today. And the last set of books that I have to recommend are middle grade, and the first one being Other Words Are Home by Jasmine Warga, who is a Jordanian-American author. This is a novel that is written in verse, and it is about a young girl named Jude who has just recently moved to America as a Syrian refugee. She is understandably struggling with this transition to a whole new country, as well as the fact that her brother and her father are still back in Syria, so she has the anxiety about that. There's also increasing Islamophobic and anti-immigrant rhetoric going on in her town. And while the story deals with a very heavy topic, it does so with an optimism and a hopefulness that a lot of middle grade novels have. It ends up being a really sweet and wholesome story about how Jude is able to find a sense of home, to find a sense of community in this new environment, which I thought was really beautiful to see. The second middle grade book I have is The Mystic School for Musicraft, which is by a repeat author, Jessica Corey, who wrote The Forbidden Wish. This is about a girl named Amelia whose absolute dream is to go to the Mystic School for Musicraft, where they basically learn to use magic with music. But she completely messes up her audition and thinks her dreams are over until the school decides to give her a trial period where she has the chance to prove that she deserves to be there. This book was such a delight, such a whimsical world. This is one book where I think it is better to read via audiobook because the audiobook includes a lot of the actual music that they describe in the story. So it's just a very nice reading experience to have. But the story also has a lot of depth to it that I didn't think would be in there when I first read it. It talks about imposter syndrome, it talks about grief, there's lovely explorations of friendship. It's just so fun. You should read it. And now we are finally to the last book on this list, which is Once Upon an Eid, which is a short story collection edited by S.K. Ali and Aisha Saeed. This is a short story collection written by Muslim authors centering the holiday of Eid, exploring, one, the different ways that different ethnicities and cultures celebrate Eid, as well as different religious sects within Islam, but also giving us a snapshot of what the holiday can mean to different people. Some of the stories are more bittersweet, some of them are very happy and comedic. As I mentioned in the description, all of these authors are Muslim, but not all of them are Arab. However, I believe 3 of them are Arab, and that is Randa Abdel Fattah, who we saw before, who wrote The Lines We Cross. There is Sarah El-Fajih, who's a Jordanian-American author who illustrated a graphic novel short story that is in this collection, and Huda El-Marashi, who is an Iraqi writer. So yeah, not too much else to say besides the fact that it's short, it's sweet. I think whether you are the middle grade audience or not, you'll enjoy this, and that goes for all the middle grade novels and all the YA novels for that matter that I recommended. I think anyone can find some level of enjoyment in them and take something away that is valuable. So that is the end of the list of recommendations for books by Arab authors that I have. Please let me know if there are any that have caught your interest and that you're excited to explore. I know for me growing up, it was very difficult to find books written by Arab authors, and for a while I thought there would never be books, that I would never see myself represented or see authors who were like myself represented. And I remember looking up these lists on Google, searching for books written by Arab authors or Muslim authors, and not really finding a lot, specifically in the YA and middle grade categories. I know there is definitely a lot more in the adult category that I just hadn't been exposed to yet, and there's definitely a lot that I missed and that I haven't read to this day. But that's why I think it's really important to highlight these authors, because a lot of times they do exist. They're just not always put at the forefront or recommended a ton. And so, especially as someone who was part of that community, I definitely want to try harder to seek out those stories. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.